So we are going to now discuss governance, and the big elephant in the room as far as urbanization process in India is concerned is that unless we have these major essential set of governance reforms which empower the urban local bodies in a way, for instance, what the young lady there referred to, how do you get citizen participation in a way that this whole urbanization process becomes political? This report basically talks a great deal about the 74th Amendment and why the 74th Amendment was very progressive in the way it was designed, because a mayor is eventually going to be elected at very regular intervals and have executive powers. And since that has not happened to the extent that was envisaged, primarily because the set of legislations have not been put in place, this becomes a key impediment. But you know, Adi, this is a question I'd like to start off. How much is a governance in the way the US cities, for instance, are, or through the metro, monitor that you have for the global 300 cities, how much does governance matter?
Former colleague back in Washington, D.C. at the Brookings Institution, Rob Fuentes, who actually started this project, and some of you maybe even had a chance to meet when he made a trip to Delhi this past winter. We put out a report that kind of said exactly that you know, the smart cities industry is full of a lot of hype. I think it's really driven so far by corporate interests, and for good reason, to sell products that can make cities run better. But that's many ways a backwards look at development, right? Corporations don't develop cities. Cities, and therefore their people, develop cities. So how can you have a governance framework that works in a unique local circumstance, wherever you might be in the world, whether you're in the United States or India, that has very clear economic, social, environmental outcomes in their mind that they want to achieve, and how can then technology help them get there? If the governance is done from too far away, then it's very difficult to tap into the local tastes of what those outcomes might be. And if there are local governance systems, but they're not empowered to make big decisions, whether it be attracting private capital, or even listening to citizens' interests, it's going to be very difficult to make good on those outcomes as well. So inherently, I think it's a great question. You know, the question of how much does governance involve in the smart cities? Well, the same way governance is involved in anything involving city. It's paramount. It's the foundation of the entire, at least civic-driven approach to what goes on in cities.
So now moving back to the broader smart city ambition that we have, I think through this report what we are trying to do is also raise a certain degree of dialogue and discussion in the public policy space for further governance reform. The 74th Amendment, and this is where I keep coming back to, there are great international comparisons, but we already have, it's not like, you know, starting out from complete scratch. There is a framework that has been passed by the Parliament. It's the implementation of it which is lacking. And there is a sense through our discussion, because this process, this report has really emerged out of dialogues and discussions and roundtables with the 3 local governments at the city level as well. And the one sense we get is that while the 14th Finance Commission has handled, you know, the center to state devolution, that next stage which is required to empower the urban local body is almost like it's a no-no. We have not started discussing that because we believe it's not going to happen. And yet everything that we hear in terms of realizing the potential eventually, and we will also talk to Vikram now about the financing and how financing limitations can emerge until the urban local bodies are you know, they are empowered to invest in some of these instruments. This is a discussion I think which we need to have, and we need to go out and sort of raise awareness and talk a great deal more about it. But there is one sense that because we believe it's not going to happen, SPV is seen, the special purpose vehicles that have been designed are seen as a way of getting around this next stage of devolution of powers. The problem, again, in speaking with the, you know, the different urban local bodies and the state governments have been that the SPVs are of multiple different kinds. And the SPVs, the status of the legal status of the SPVs and the executive powers of the SPVs are also not completely well defined right now, which can then effectively circumvent it from this, you know, devolution which is not happening. So for SPVs to take off, multiple things have to happen, and this is where, Adi, I'd like to ask you a very specific question vis-a-vis the American market, which is a federal structure, but almost all cities in the US provide public utilities through this public-private partnership that have happened and which have been a great success. So what are those, some of those key lessons which we need to take to the Indian cities for the SPVs here to take off?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's been one of the best parts about doing this project is learning. It's really, the same as my colleague Elizabeth who's here with us, much of our work focuses on the U.S. market, so it's been a great kind of bilateral information exchange on different governance frameworks. And in many ways, one of the core differences is the United States markets has deep-seated empowerment due to our initial, frankly, independent structure, right, about republicanism and federalism that empowered local bodies, right? In our case, whether they be typically cities in certain parts of the United States, especially the oldest parts, townships, but effectively they have deep revenue-raising authority that is independent from their states, which then, of course, even more independent from the federal body. Yet, even within that marketplace, truly public governments, right? They are trying to achieve outcomes that oftentimes have very little financial return, right? Again, as was mentioned previously, it's important to have public transportation. I think something that a lot of my work focuses on. Public transportation will never pay for itself, right? It's just not by design meant to pay for itself. It's something we all pool our resources together because the positive externalities, as economists call, are so big that we will provide that service. So when you need to get on the Delhi Metro, let's say, right, the Delhi Metro is there for you, right? And we as a common body will pay for that. But in many other components of public life, there's a need for a private approach as well. And there are opportunities for constant streams of revenue, and to be able to capture those to invest back in the infrastructure in the local system. So really, almost as old as the entire union, the United States is we have used what originally were turnpike authorities, which were building roads that were not even paved at the time, of course, to now, of course, in modern times, what we see as most prevalent are Rick and I were talking a little bit before we started here on what we call port authorities, but related to airports, to seaports typically, bridge authorities, especially where he now lives in the greater New York area, and that ability to capture a revenue base, to say you are going to either pay for your water or you must cross this bridge, so we have a captive audience. That effectively sets up government to be set up separate units. Again, we tend to call them authorities. I think in the Indian context where you borrowed that kind of governance structure, which for those in the know, as we learned in this report in the United Kingdom, are called quanjos. It's the same idea. Is really using private-style business practice through full public ownership. So it's basically a publicly owned private company that can use those captive revenues as leverage to attract private capital for long-term investment in infrastructure and pay back those, well, in the American context via bonds, those revenues are the collateral, right? And that has been incredibly effective in the United States to produce what, as those of us who are Americans in the audience know right now, there's a lot of hand-wringing about how good our infrastructure is, but our infrastructure actually is quite competitive internationally. So what's built, I think you could argue, a very competitive urban infrastructure system. This has been a really key component of it.
Great. This takes me to the point which we raise, and we discussed this again in the report a great deal, that the experience of the last 10 years of the PPPs that we have had in the infrastructure, the public-private partnerships, which has been one of the reasons why people today blame the large NPAs that are sitting with the public sector banks, is for the nature of these the PPPs and the way they were contracted, which is why perhaps these SPVs in the smart city sense, because you're talking about revenue raising authority, and eventually that is what is going to determine whether these SPVs really do take off in the long term in a sustainable way, whether they're able to raise the revenue to provide these different services and infrastructure. This takes me to one of those key fundamental financial instruments which have been used in certain global markets, not everywhere equally successfully, are the municipal bonds. Vikram, as the head of municipal strategy at Citigroup in the US, tell us first of all, just in terms of, give us a primer, what are municipal bonds?
Sure, Shamika. So a municipal bond is issued by a state or local government, and it is used to finance long-term capital projects. And these are long-term, long-lived capital projects. The market will thrive in any nation which has a federalist system of governance. What is the federalist system of governance? As Adi mentioned, It is basically where there is a separation of powers between the central government and the state and the local government. So essentially the state or the local government has the ability to collect taxes and issue bonds. So which are the federal system of governance in the world? There's obviously the US. India is another excellent example. Then you have the UK, you have Germany, and you have Australia. In some sense, China has allowed some of its local entities to issue debt. Now, so municipal bonds essentially what it enables, so typically state and local governments, they can pay for their capital spendings through current revenues. But by issuing bonds, by issuing long-term bonds, it enables future generations to bear the cost of an amenity which is built today. So essentially it's a form of asset liability matching, right? Now municipal bonds, and this was alluded to by Shamika and Adi both. So what is the revenue which is backing a municipal bond? So there are 2 or 3 types of municipal bonds. The first and foremost is general obligation. General obligation meaning that the state or the local government that issues the bond says, I will make you whole. It is backed by the full faith and credit of the issuing authority. And how does, say a state like New York, a state like New Jersey, if Andhra Pradesh issues bonds, how will they guarantee payment? They'll guarantee payment by virtue of their revenues, by virtue of their ability to collect taxes. This is the most popular form of financing. It's the most popular form of bonds in the US municipal market because it's generally believed that the full faith and credit pledge count for a lot. Then you have a revenue bond. A revenue bond is it's kind of self-sustaining like a project. It can be the Delhi Noida expressway that you pay a toll on the way and it's self-financing. So the tolls pay for the project, and so that's a revenue bond. And then you have something else known as double barrel bonds. Double barrel bonds are important because and I read the report in great detail. It's an excellent report. So for instance, you have a lot of these local issuing authorities like Allahabad, like Ajmer, like Visakhapatnam. The rating is not very good, right? I mean that's the truth. The best rating is single A, and that's rated by CARE, and then you have triple B, and then you have single B. And why is that? Even though a lot of these cities have the ability to collect a wide range of revenues, taxes like property tax, professional tax, education tax, entertainment tax. I don't even know what that is, right? Entertainment tax, but still the actual revenue generating capability is quite low when you compare it to a city like say Chicago or New York or a small city like Hoboken where I live, where 2% of the net worth of my house has to go into property taxes every year. Otherwise, the local government will seize my property. So a double barrel bond is a combination of the full faith and credit bond, the GO, the general obligation bond, and a revenue bond, meaning that they issue bonds for a project which is supposed to be self-sustaining. But if the cash flows from the project don't meet the needs for interest and principal payments, then the backup is the issuing authority, like a state or local government, which steps and says, yes, I will make you whole. And that is important because, so US Treasury, for instance, the US federal government's debt is rated AA plus. You have a lot of state and local government entities which are rated even higher, AAA. And that just tells you that, basically there is not this knock-on effect by a higher form of government, which impedes the rating of a lower authority. So it is possible for a lot of the projects which will be financed in Allahabad, Visakhapatnam or Ajmer to have a much higher rating than say single A or triple B. And that's important because in my experience, investors penalize any bond. So just to give you an idea, so speculative grade bond, a speculative grade bond is something which is rated triple B minus, lower than triple B minus, right? Anything which is rated lower than triple B minus gets penalized a lot by investors, in the sense that investors demand a lot of yield for it, right? Anyway, another thing which is very important for municipal financing is tax exemption. Now you have a lot of municipal issuing authorities in India also, the National Highway Authority, the railways issues municipal bonds. These are tax exempt bonds. And tax exempt bonds essentially means that the federal government will not collect taxes, and supposing you are a resident of the state of say Andhra Pradesh issues municipal bonds, they will not collect state tax either. And it's very important because it enables the municipal authority to go and issue debt at a cost which is much lower than the average cost in the market. For instance, let's say for example, that I am in a 35% tax rate. So if I'm in a 35% tax rate, I can buy a treasury bond which is yielding 3%. Okay? Now, or I can go and buy a tax exempt bond which is yielding 2%. I'm indifferent between the two because on a tax adjusted basis they're both equivalent. So in theory what happens is that the entire benefit of tax exemption is not realized, and the investor will typically get a municipal bond which is yielding 2.5%. So it's a win-win for the issuer and the investor. The investor gets slightly higher yields, the issuer is able to issue debt at a slightly lower rate. But then again, tax exemption is not free, because essentially what is happening, the federal government is subsidizing the state and local governments. So that cost of subsidy is immense. In the US, the cost of subsidy, say in 2014, was about $30 billion. But it's important. Now, there are challenges in India for the municipal market to succeed, for tax exemption to succeed, and I'll be very honest. Firstly, two things are important. Firstly, the Indian tax system, the Indian tax net has holes in it, meaning that there's this entire shadow economy that does not pay taxes. They don't care about tax exemption, right? So they would be indifferent. They will not go and buy a low yielding bond because they say, okay, I don't pay taxes anyway, why should I care about it? And secondly, there has to be a question of education and awareness among investors. For instance, I'll give you a personal example. My mother-in-law sold her flat in Hyderabad. She had money to invest. I was trying to convince her, buy the highway authority bond, it's yielding 6%. She says, nahi, I want to buy the 7.5% wala CD, well the FD rather, because that's what she knows, that's what she's familiar with. She doesn't care about tax exemption. So there are challenges, as far as the Indian system is concerned, even with tax exemption. But then again, the Indian system of governance, the federalist system I just spoke of, is tailor-made for the municipal market. You can stop me and ask me a question.
But tell me, if it is such a great product and it is succeeding in the US, why did it not succeed in Germany and UK? Or anywhere else? So
even in India, who spent in the 90s peddling, and USAID was one of them, and World Bank was another, peddling the idea of municipal bonds here. Surat and Ahmedabad were the two first.
we talk about those in, yeah.
Yeah, so, and I talked to a lot of the financiers who had accredited. There are very good reasons why it makes no sense, but I would like to know what they are.
So firstly, so there has to be the full faith and credit pledge has to mean something, So for instance, and I don't want to penalize, I don't want to taint any political party, but you can't have something like free services. So that pledge that that I'll collect taxes, I'll collect revenues, that pledge is sacrosanct. That cannot be turned off and switched on, because you will lose credibility among investors. So for instance, the Bridge and Tunnel Authority in the tri-state area, the New Jersey, New York, Connecticut area. When I moved to that area through the East Coast, say 10 years ago, so there's a Lincoln Tunnel, the Holland Tunnel, and on the Washington Bridge which connects New Jersey to New York. To cross the tunnel, it would cost me $8. Today, it costs me $16. I have no choice but to pay, because these entities have unlimited rate setting authority. So that is something, that pledge to collect revenues means something, and that has to mean something. So there is concern, there is what should I say, that we are unsure, most foreign investors are unsure about the political system in India, in the political setup in India. So that is why maybe that is one of the reasons that didn't succeed in the 90s. Now turning to the European countries that you mentioned, so every story is different, and of course there's no guarantee that it will succeed in India even now. I'll be very honest, because ultimately it requires political will. Our leaders have to rise above political infighting and demagoguery and think about the good of the nation. Now Prime Minister Modi definitely inspires confidence. So does Chief Minister Chandrababu Naidu, and that's not an exhaustive list, but political will is the preliminary requirement. And let's turn to something like UK. Why didn't it succeed in the UK? And again, there are some technical details involved. So in the UK, there used to be this public works loan board. The public works loan board is basically a federal entity. So you have all these local authorities in the UK. The local authorities in the UK will finance their projects by getting grants from the Public Works Loan Board, which is a federal entity. Let's think of it as a central government. Now, what they decided that in order to jumpstart the municipal market, the Federal Works Loan Board said that okay, we are going to raise our lending rates above the rate which is offered by gilts, which is the sovereign bond of the UK. So essentially, what they were trying to do is that look, our financing rate, our lending rate is higher, so go and get money from the market, right? So that was the idea. So they raised their rates 20 to 30 basis points above the UK gilt. So the local entity says, okay, this is not going to work. We are going to raise money from the market, and that was the intent, that we will jumpstart the municipal market. And they would have been able to do that. But then what happened is that the Public Works Loan Board actually reneged on that transaction. So they went and cut their rates again. So when they went and cut their rates again, why would a municipal entity go and tap the capital markets when a cheaper source of funding is available from the federal government, from the grant? So that essentially that hamstrung the growth of the UK market, right? Now, and Germany and Australia, they're slightly smaller markets. We had great hope from the UK market. Now you have something like China, for instance. China is another instance. Now China does not have to deal with the inefficiencies of a democracy that we have to deal with, right? And again, I'm not trying to run down democracy. I think it's the best form of governance. There's no doubt about that. And again, when I talk about the fact that our leaders have to rise above demagoguery, well, India is not the only nation that suffers from this malady. That is true in every nation. But I'm a US citizen now, and we have the same problem there, that we have a deeply divided House and Senate, and it's very difficult to get work done. So leaders have to work together. Now in China, for instance, in China, you don't really have a federalist form of governance. Their system of governance is not really a democracy, but local authorities are not allowed to issue debt, but they have something known as local government finance vehicles. Now, local government finance vehicles would actually go and issue debt on behalf of the local government, but it was more of an implicit guarantee. But what was happening was that the transparency was very low. There was very little monitoring, and there's a lot of debt issuance which wasn't monitored well. So you had some very leveraged entities, and there was no return to show for it. So in 2014, China instituted reforms in some way. They said, okay, we will let the local authorities issue debt. So, and it is important. So it was getting troublesome proportion, because the debt which is owed by these local government finance vehicles was 38% of China's GDP. And China is a very big economy, so you can imagine how leveraged these entities were. So, reforms were instituted in 2014, and local governments were allowed to issue debt. The market in China started with a bang. They issued $598 billion worth of debt in 1 year alone. A lot of these were debt swaps. So essentially what was happening was that a local entity would say, okay, we'll buy back our outstanding debt and refinance it at a slightly lower rate. Now for that to succeed, it has to be a better rated institution, an institution which has low leverage, because otherwise nobody is going to buy a new debt, because that's how a refinance works. You issue new debt to buy back old debt, and you issue new debt at lower rates so that the transaction is economic. And there are benefits to that, because the new debt, there is better transparency, there is better monitoring. It enables you to build out a capital curve, and then again, because it is backed with the full faith and credit of the local entity rather than an implicit guarantee, there is investor demand for it. There is foreign buyer demand for it, and anything which increases your buyer base will bring down your cost of funding. So I am optimistic about the municipal market in China. Yes.
The problem why the Indian bond market, municipal bond market has not developed is because the central government has been very clearly off on municipal bond market.
True.
The reason for that is municipal bonds, if there are of the three layers of debt, the central government debt obviously carries a sovereign guarantee. State government debt in India also carries a sovereign guarantee. And because of that, the yield curve among the states instead of reflecting their fiscal condition, is actually the same. And this is where the trouble is. So it's now that the state governments are being nudged to price themselves out of the sovereign guarantee. Once we have learned, because the states are going to borrow now from the markets, it's from the last fiscal that they have started actually going to the markets in larger numbers to borrow. The state governments actually were taking only state development funds, just one 10-year, one flat vanilla paper. Whether the states and the municipal governments have the ability to price themselves. It is after that when we will be, and at that stage will be the issue of who is able to service the debts, those would come in. You know,
Correct,
so
correct.
it's fairly political agnostic question, I would say at this point.
No, no, but
The more challenging thing, sorry, if I may just one thing, is I think the governance issue. I think once that elephant is not settled, lots of issues will not be settled. Thank you.
no, that's a good point. It goes back to my earlier point that the full faith and credit pledge has to mean something, right? So the Indian markets, they are developing. They're not as advanced as the financial markets in the US or in the UK. So
Financial markets are as developed in India as anywhere else. The credibility of
Sorry.
institutions is not as developed as an American city. I'd be very interested in the position in Canada, because that's a very similar situation to the US. It's a federal system. Is the municipal bond market very evolved in Canada?
it's not as evolved as the US. It's a
Why?
much smaller market. It's
Why?
a much smaller market. Well, again, so municipal entities, and firstly to your point that the financial market is as developed in India. How deep is the corporate market? Huh?
No,
How
hold
deep
on.
is the corporate market?
Corporate market is just one of the various elements of financial markets. I was taking issue to your point about financial markets not being developed in India. Our stock markets, for instance, are probably one of the more developed or regulated. But since we're talking about municipal bonds,
Yeah.
we're not talking about financial markets. Why is it that when we talk about munis, we only talk about the US and no other country?
Because the US has the most advanced municipal market in the world. So it's a template that other democracies should follow. So again, like I said, in India, the federalist system of governance, the fact that the structure of governance is tailor-made for municipal issues. Now, India does not have to ape any template. We can follow our own model for sure. But then again,
Asking about India, sir. I'm just making a very small point on muni bonds, right? I'm not talking about India at all. Here we are to learn from your international experiences. The top livable cities in the world, not one is an American city. Of all the rankings that I have seen, let's talk about Canadian cities, let's talk about Australian cities, which are considered highly livable, Northern European cities. Why are they not into municipal bonds?
well, so
That actually, that I think Adi might be in a better position about why. Well, financing is one aspect of a smart city, so that cities don't get bankrupt, and there is there are many instruments. There's always a bouquet of instruments that cities must, which ties into the governance eventually. That it is obviously this is one instrument which has succeeded in one market, and there are private players who are seeing similarities and the possibility of advancing similar instruments here. But unless we make some of these governance reforms, again going back to the 74th, where SPVs get better defined and empowered to come up with various, either the pricing, contracting, how to enforce the contract. For us, this is a lesson from the last 10 years. Whether it is really just a legality or is it the enforcement aspect of it, whether the implementation of these contracts, whether that is a shortfall and how do we overcome that. Charges and user fees. Can we really price some of these utilities? And this is where, Vikram, actually I will agree with the points that they are making, is that a financial instrument can be very strong, it can be a very smart financial instrument, but unless again you can back it by the appropriate, the political will definitely matters, but water is a very sensitive issue. It is going to be a while before we see the development of water markets in India. Though there is a recognition that almost all, all of South Delhi definitely, is private water, private water supplies. And this takes us back to the point that Mr. Kant made, is that the whole idea of smart cities that we are trying to define from above and bring it down to the city level. And what you, Sailesh, spoke about is that citizens' engagement and a bottoms-up approach to what are those amenities that are required. Noida and Gurgaon, and this we again discussed in the report, is there are very interesting comparisons. Because while Gurgaon has emerged as a private city, there is private security, there is private water, there is private electricity. The private part of the markets, they are working very well, but private markets will only work up to that much. A government cannot abdicate certain responsibilities because cities have public utilities, they have public goods, and for the provision of those public goods, we need the government. And this is where the roads will come in. In fact, beyond a point, security will be. There will be, and this is where again, whether you can use certain instrument and you can charge for those amenities that the state is going to be providing becomes very, very important.
Shamika, I have a fundamental problem. You just made a very loaded statement. Gurgaon, private city, is working very well.
No. I'm not saying it's a private city working well. If you live in Delhi, you cannot make that statement that Gurgaon is.
I'm talking about Gurgaon. The Gurgaon itself, I've been actually trying to get this. It's the gated communities which quote unquote work well by take any of your
Absolutely.
But for the general population,
It is not working, yes.
Now, maybe we should get back to the governance.
No, but that's exactly what we're talking about, Anupam.
but-
That while in Gurgaon, which is a private city because everything privatized seems to be, but the minute you step out of your gated community, there is a breakdown.
And
Noida,
population as well.
Noida is an interesting contrast because Noida is rather well planned. Noida has good public utilities, but the private part of the market there is missing. So now for us, it seems like smart cities experimentation that we are going to do will have to straddle these two sides. We will have to think of private solutions, but the government has to perform.
The smart city is what, I'm still confused. The smart city is a financially viable city. The standard one, there was an IBM Cisco version. The other version, until the smart cities came, Brookings also got involved with it, the World Bank and all the multilaterals with it. Livable, competitive and sustainable cities were the three dimensions people said are subsumed under smart. And then in the smart to bring in use of technology that people said was the now dimension. If you are just talking, you could add a fifth one, then it has to be financially sustainable. And that's where the matter is in India, if you go through the numbers just don't add up to have the sort of structures that are viable that you're talking about. Even in the area of governance, you have to go back to the history of, we are talking about governance here. Go back to Jonathan Roch's work, where he looked at the difference between elected cities and metropolitan agglomerations with elected mayors versus where you had municipal commissioners who were executives. The story of infrastructure development in those two areas is very different. One could argue that all the things that we are peddling on the one side is actually inapplicable because the model that seemed to work better for at least the problems identified is exactly the opposite. So let's be a little more precise both with governance and in terms of when we are talking about smart, which dimension are you talking about smart? Smart is just a well-managed city. That's not
I think let him answer the question about, that's a very good question. Sailesh will come to you. That question that
actually-
in the top cities,
No, sorry.
none of
I
the
just
US
wanted to focus on Allahabad, Ajmer, and Vizag.
right.
There's no point talking about so many Indian cities. The objective function, I thought, was with the U.S. government's help. They will win the competition, right? And we know that in the first 20 cities, Vizag is the only one that made it.
That's true.
And quite frankly, I've read all the 20 smart city plans. Vizag didn't deserve to win. Now, the objective function now, therefore, is how would you enable Allahabad and Ajmer to win?
So,
you
so
made
this
a-
is where,
you made a really
Adib,
interesting
Adib,
point. I
before,
wanna stitch these up.
before you finish that, this is an independent study done by Brookings. We are not trying for the US government to help Ajmer and Allahabad win. In fact, if you saw that graph, it tells you why they didn't win. Okay, just in terms of governance, you see that they are significantly, statistically, much lower in their governance preparedness compared to the 20 cities. The reason I have put that in that report is also because when we started doing roundtables in the local places, one response from Allahabad was, this is, ये तो political है, ये तो opposition में है, तो they haven't selected us. Maybe, but the data shows, the data shows that as far as the 18th, the 12th schedule is concerned, the 18 roles that were roles that were cut out for the urban local bodies, how many have been legislated by these different states, and that is where we have basically ranked. So neither are we here to say whether US government, how they should be assisting them. In fact, we would like more and more cities to basically cut that, the basic threshold and be selected, but this is a competitive process. Funds have opportunity cost. For every 20 that will be selected and checks will be cut, there will be many which will not be, but that process now we have 13 more that have been. Adi, going back to the comparison, the international comparison that you were making.
Yeah, totally. So first of all, this format is fantastic. I wish we could bring this back. I'm literally going to the United States. We're too stuffy about, you talk, you wait for questions, this is awesome. So with that said, I probably am not as aggressive as I should be to jump in. To try to stitch these points together a little bit, but a response, but not a defensive one at all. I think you're absolutely right, as people, and our colleague Vinay from the United States is in the audience too, so I'm not sure if anyone else from the United States. There's no question that we tend to not rank highly on those livability lists, which is really what they are, right? The Economist Intelligence Unit puts them out, Fast Company, but everyone puts out lists these days, right? It sells, it's good, we do it too. In many ways, I think it's a conflation of what were developmental decisions that the United States made, right? In fact, it's ironic always for us to come to this part of the world because as much as we've exported jeans and baseball hats to certain places, we've also exported highways, right? In fact, a partner research venture that we have going at the Brookings Institution with my colleagues on the global development side is to look at, in particular, one component of it is how the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the ADB here, they've built deeply into their infrastructure investment models to prioritize highway investments, right? But that has all kinds of negative externalities that we are now living with in the United States. Almost like we can report out from the future, right, to every other place. This is what your communities will look like. I think in many ways, the reflection of places like Melbourne or Vancouver, Canada, or Vienna, which is almost always considered maybe the best place in the world to live. These are markets that were either developed prior to the automobile or did not tear down entire neighborhoods for the most part to put through too much resources. Now they have their own challenges on economic geography, which is what Elizabeth's an expert in. Now that we know, you can jump in. Feel free. I think, but in many ways, those American markets were developed that way, because to speak to the governance point is, they were responding to citizen interest. You can put this whole thing on, for many of us probably in the room are very fortunate and probably have been, now we've been to India, you've probably been in the United States, of course. You can put that all on General Motors, but the American people wanted that. All of the honest history on this is it was a mix of both, right? Corporate America responds to markets, right? I mean, period, to customer demand. That's what moves everything. And much like when we try to talk about defining the smart city, it's really, there is no such thing as a smart city. This is the best marketing trick of all in this whole thing, right? Every city you go to, at least on the United States side, I'm not sure what the experience was like on the grand tour here in India, is how do I become a smart city? Well, no one can tell you that. You define what a smart city is, right? It's what your citizenship wants. Because what is that city of tomorrow that will create, at least as we would, I think, commonly define it anywhere in the world, is how can there be greater economic opportunity for our children, and as well as to make sure that's everything from jobs to good living, et cetera, et cetera. It's that motivation of the future, right? That is the inherent role of government to deliver on that. And what's an incredible opportunity in today's world is how can we use digital technology to make good on that? All of the leapfrogging that our colleague mentioned earlier is made possible due to digital technology. And what we see in different examples all across the world on smart cities is what works well is not about using necessarily, although finance is very important, but it's finance is responding to what the demands are of its citizens as well, right? Same as the tech cannot be there. So in efforts like in what we found in Medellin, So Medellin, Colombia is winning awards left and right to become, of course, the great new urban center of the world after, after the cartels obviously had their collapse. Now they've come up, which is like a real thing there. And what they really did was it was about people. It wasn't about industry. It wasn't about moving dollars, but plenty of dollars have been moved, right? It was about responding to people. So what did they build? They have 160 public, without time limit, Wi-Fi hotspots across the city. They've built a tremendous amount of libraries. What they've won the most awards for is building I believe the most used cable car system in the entire world. You've now been seeing some of the pictures of it during the Rio Olympics. They've been effectively copying the Medellin system. And outdoor escalators that go up one very specific favela that you could knock it down from, right? That was realizing that people needed access to economic opportunity. The finance, the technology, it all fell in behind responding to customer demand. And those investments have helped pay for themselves, right? To counterpoint, in Nairobi, Kenya, they have gone primarily to the question on greenfield development earlier. I'm not sure if it's seen it, sorry. They have gone in for very specific business style parks, brand new style, some of it inside the city, some of it on the periphery, but basically this is building cities for high-end businesses to attract international capital. And what they've effectively done, as they've seen in Nairobi's numbers, is they've not helped the aggregate, the full population of their base. So I'm sure some boats have been lifted, but it is not lifted all. To me, that is the utmost definition of the difference between Medellin, that is a smart city. And it's not because of the tech, which the tech is there. When you win international awards from, I just saw just this past month, they won an award from Singapore. They recently, 2 years ago, won an award from the Urban Land Institute of the United States. So this is a global winning place. You win awards for being a smart city because you're delivering real results, right? Whereas in Nairobi, which many are looking to in the African context because, of course, the relatively more dynamic economy in that both metro region and the country, they're looking, businesses see it as a success, but there's not many awards being won, right? And it's because at the end of the day, they're not really helping their people. I can only speak as an outsider, right? Is when we saw those developmental metrics, and I think, again, probably spoke about this. You know, it doesn't take but international development 101 in any undergraduate or graduate college across the world to see, you know, you have to have a foundation of an educated and physically healthy people, right? These to me are very clear targets, right? And if you can build out good revenue streams to help deliver on that, good, strong, sound governance, everyone can win in that situation. And the most important one of all is the long-term economic outlook for India's cities and its people, right? So there's a lot to like here. The digital infrastructure can do it, but it's not going to be defined unless local leaders are empowered and can make good on those promises.
So this is what takes us to, in fact, the first chapter of the book, the report. We talk about engines of growth, which I motivated earlier. And this takes you to basically, if you compare, again, Ajmer, Allahabad and Vizag, and particularly Allahabad and Vizag, I think are very telling, is if you look at the existing trend, then you know that very different sectors are really adding to the GDP of these three states. So Ajmer, in fact, at the city level, Ajmer is still very much an agricultural GDP. It has most of its money coming from agriculture. Allahabad is unregistered manufacturing. Vizag is mostly infrastructure led. So if you look at the trend and you look at what those engines are, I'm a little reluctant to call them engines of growth because if you looked at the data in 1991 for Andhra Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh, they are very similar. The populations are very similar, the size was very similar, predominantly agriculture. Who would have predicted, if you went by past projections, that AP would be where it is today and UP would be where it is? And when I say where it is, I'm talking about poverty numbers. In 25 years, if you compare 1991 with today's data, you will see that both of them, by the way, also had similar poverty levels. Uttar Pradesh had 51, Andhra Pradesh had 48% poverty in early 90s. Today, Andhra Pradesh has poverty of 11%. Uttar Pradesh has poverty of 38%. Now, if you look at the existing trends, you make certain projections, which is what we economists do. But what we really discount, going back to governance, is what political entrepreneurship can do. It took a Chandrababu Naidu to make these drastic, what we in economics call exogenous shocks to the system. It took a YSR to continue with that shock. He stuck to the same set of economic and development policy. So while growth happened in those services sector and infrastructure led, simultaneously they were making the right set of investments in NREGA, in Rajiv Arogya Shri Health Insurance Program and infrastructure. Together that has led to this whole idea of this trickle down, which is what growth, if done right, for people is meant to achieve. But there is no way for us to have predicted that. That is the nature of economic research, that you can't predict, it's a random walk. Leadership is something, each state can pray that Chandrababu Naidu would come along. And yet that is what governance is. If done right, and again, if 74th Amendment is actually implemented so that mayors are empowered, so that political representation of the citizens of the city actually feeds into the policies and the new projects of the city, then you don't really need Chandrababu Naidus. You don't need these exogenous shocks, is what we basically try and motivate. That is why governance matters. So that it becomes an automatic, it really doesn't rely on idiosyncrasies. So those are the kind of, motivations. For, say that again?
That's a utopian world.
And yet you have seen Chandrababu Naidu happen. It's not utopia at all. In fact, given the 14th Finance Commission, now it's the time for these utopians to be realized because states are going to experiment.
On Andhra Pradesh specifically, Hyderabad, it's just the political relationship of the state government and the city government. So Hyderabad, if you recall, in 2001-2, had a brilliant mayor who was very dynamic, and Samir Sharma, who's now Smart Cities Mission, he was municipal commissioner to that mayor. The same Samir Sharma was again municipal commissioner in 2009 when they had changed the direct election to the indirect election. So effectively, no state government in India, I know of none, would want to empower mayors. Imagine if Vizag had someone like Chandrababu Naidu as a mayor, of course Vizag would prosper,
Correct.
or Allahabad for that matter. But have you heard of any two-term mayor in India? Not one?
We haven't heard of mayors in India, that's the problem.
No, we have actually. Ram Gopal Mohole is the mayor of Varanasi, but nobody's heard of him, right?
Exactly.
Why? Why is this, there is no two-term mayor in India, whereas there are two-term chief ministers in India? Why? The answer is very simple. No, the answer is actually the fatal flaw in the 74th Amendment, which is called rotation.
Yeah, it's like the women's reservation
It's
in the
not like,
panchayat.
it's not
which
like
is
the women's reservation. The women's reservation effectively says that if Harsha is not going to be eligible, his wife is going to be eligible.
Okay.
But this is
women, yeah,
this
women
is
has always been-
caste-based. If I am a wonderful tribal mayor, the next time it's going to be reserved for an OBC
Right.
or an SC.
Right.
So it's almost
Rotation as well.
100% sure that a good mayor is not even going to run for re-election, let alone be re-elected.
So then the incentives are all skewed, yes.
I'm no policy expert and this is true to entering this field. But I have traveled down to Allahabad from childhood every year for the last 21 years because my ancestors were there. And I've seen the city grow and I've seen the problem. What I've heard around there is the issue of Noida, the money going to political parties, people, and builders getting money in Gurgaon. You can see it happening in Allahabad with both those things being one. There are certain individuals who have key properties in Allahabad and they're both politically very influential at the ground level. And they are the powers that pull all the strings at the municipal level. So is the municipal level the right place to pitch such growth? Because we know what we stand at. We know, as Sir said a while ago, that we have to be smart for smart cities to work. At the local level, are we smart enough for municipal level organization to drive this growth? Do we have that ability, or still we are certain years far from that stage to actually attempt something so ambitious?
No, that's a great question. And by the way, similar questions were asked when this devolution happened from the center to the state, that we are going to see a divergence in performance of states. Certain states will thrive because they do have the institutions and the right set of governance. And there are some that will lag. And that growing disparity is something that we have to be willing to live with, because it's again, in a simple, game theoretic sense, it's a really bad equilibrium if we are going to wait for that capacity at the city to emerge before these shocks are. Because on average, the sense is that when this devolution happened, the responsibility is of the local government. So when we say that this city deserves the government it has, for a long time, originally I'm from Bihar, we keep hearing that Biharis deserve the government that they have, and yet Nitish in his first term was very progressive. He went about doing a lot of good. In fact, the HDI improved a lot. So, I mean, what's to say that you can never really wait for capacities to reach a certain threshold before experimentation starts. Yes, Shubham.
Yeah. This is about, we might audible as.
We are audible, that is true. Actually, you might not be because they are recording.
No, I think to take on from what you're saying about local governance also gets traction when it delivers results which people can watch and then people are willing to pay. DTC has raised its fare by about 70% in the last 6 years. There's been no protest. Nobody has been they have felt discomfort because the visibility of a good functioning transport system has been very visible in Delhi. So the AC buses run, people get at every level, they are able to buy into a bus at 25 rupee and they like the comfort that they get. Whereas the same sort of a thing didn't happen with LPG connection, where there was a lot of, when prices were to be raised, people had a lot of objection to it because they saw LPG being pilfered. So I think visibility of result buys in a lot of constituency from the public.
Right. No, I completely agree with you, Shubhamoy, and this is something that I had written about, in fact, in reference to this some time back when, and I understand when people say smart cities require smart citizens. But again, going back to fundamental economics, we believe everybody is rational. If the circumstances around can be created for them to behave optimally. It's the same Delhiites who behave in a certain way in other public life who form a line when it comes to metro. And you have to wonder what is it about metro that makes people, the same citizens, so much better behave. And I think it goes back to the fundamental point you made, that if there is delivery and the quality is good and there is a certainty about the availability of that service, people respond adequately.
But at the same time, the Delhi metro, the toll bridge, the toll plaza got into severe flak.
Right.
This was a more upper heel citizen. But they created problems because they were not sure about what the delivery was.
Right.
At the lower end of the economic strata, the people who were using the bus who had much more, whose income, we were sharing a larger percentage of income.
Right.
But they were willing to pay. So I thought that was something where the results, communication was not very well.
Great.
Yeah, and John, it is a fantastic question. Speaking from the U.S. context, what we find, right, and I'm not sure, I know Donald Trump has made his way over here in terms of the news cycle, but I'm not sure if the other elements of our confidence in government have, but effectively the United States is struggling from extremely low percentage rates of confidence in our institutions. So the United States Congress is, I believe, the lowest, it's the lowest on record. I think it's like 18% confidence. It's extremely low. Yeah, right. So, but as you go down in terms of federalism to the local level of government, confidence goes up significantly. And in many ways, I think that speaks to what a local government is intended in an optimal scenario to do, which is to be a more direct response to citizen interests. Right? Now, certain elements, especially as economists tend to think about it, are beyond the scope of just a municipality. So, like effects, right? They don't have responsibility for that, so it's a different kind of picture. But elements, especially of what we tend to think about of urbanness, of cities, right? They are the natural actor to respond to citizens' interests. The question that we've been confronted with, our entire team back at the Metro program in DC as we've done this project, so again, I really am trying to be respectful as an outsider, this is just how we read the situation, is the local governments in India are not empowered. So it is really, they have not been set up to succeed, right? Now, something where actually our financial peers can teach us a lot, right, is that we cannot be scared in the public sector, in terms of government, we cannot be scared to take risks, especially at the local level. Because that's effectively where innovation comes in, and when we learn our lessons, right? So it struck us, again, just speaking from the US side, is that how is India, as an aggregate, going to figure out whether at this, probably at specific states and even down to specific city levels and district levels, how are they going to figure out, have the confidence to give certain decision-making powers to the local bodies to be more responsive to local citizens and local citizens? Because no city is ever the same, like I said last comment. But to be responsive to that it cannot be dictated from the top down, right? I mean, it's just too big of a country, right? And too many different groups and different interests, and that's a beautiful thing. But it also makes it very hard to have top-down urban governance, right? So this seems like a very clear challenge, and hopefully the Smart Cities mission offers one of its other interesting components besides just investing capital, is to take on those risks and have different kinds of governance innovation and governance tests to happen too. Not just for these projects that will be done over these 5+ years, but really years and years, decades out into the future.
Well, when you have 90% of the revenues actually coming from the else.
Right.
So, it's one thing to say you can work on it and you will get a certain subsidy which is in the order of 10 to 20% of total resource. But pretty much all the discretionary plus 5 times more is coming from a certain way with all the sorts of vested interests that get around that. In that model, the paradigm doesn't work. And I think the gentleman here who has raised the thing for them about the American experience, which is very valuable, would be Jane Jacobs' story. It's not today's story. It's how New York City got built with the developer, political and other nexus. And then how citizenry and boroughs, etc., sort of were empowered to change it all. That's where India is playing. And so you can't take analogies from today. You need to go back to the history of 100 years.
Yeah.
That is what is needed.
No, I couldn't agree more. I'm sure you want to.
Great.
The one quick comment I think to specify or to add to my last answer is government innovation isn't just empowering government in terms of making decisions. It's empowering them on the revenue side. So your point is incredibly important. We have I work in transportation primarily and infrastructure broadly, but transportation the most. In the United States conversation, and what I think, again, something we've explored the world, the United States is nothing but interstates, right? The federal investment in transportation in the United States dominates the conversation. It's 30% of revenue, right? 70% comes from state and locals. And in most markets, it's majority locals. If you interview people in the polls we do, they think all the money that's being spent on transportation in their city and county is done by the federal government. Even they don't know what they're paying for, right? So it's that pervasive in our system, how much funding actually is done locally, for good and ill. So that's clearly part of this scenario here too, right? Is the revenues there has to be an ability to either raise revenues locally, to secure them locally, and maybe there needs to be a different fiscal transfer system too, which is so important in the United States system too, which we haven't even touched on in this report, but is part of it as well.
Great. I think it's time to wrap up. We can chat over tea later. Thank you all for coming. We encourage you to read, but more importantly, do reach back, do tell us what you think once you've read, because now we're continuing the project into phase 2, where we are really going to look at each of the proposals that were put in by the cities in order to become smart, and we're going to evaluate them. So all your feedback, more than welcome. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Vikram. Thank you, Adi.